Good morning, everybody. As you know, we are very fortunate to have here today with us the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Senator Bingaman. And thank you all for coming to this NDN-sponsored event where we're going to hear about the chairman's thoughts on a number of issues, including, I understand, climate change. I just want to say a few words about NDN and the NDN Green Project, which is engaged in these issues. Many of you are probably already familiar with NDN. We are a progressive advocacy organization and think tank which works on a variety of issues, including globalization, green issues, the immigration issue, and a number of other things which are currently affecting our nation. The Green Project, which I direct, is a relatively new NDN project. And our premise is that essentially the U.S. and the world are entering a new phase of energy, which is going to transition from a carbon economy to a post-carbon economy. This is going to be a very complex transition, and a lot of policy changes are going to happen that will be a part of it. And so it's a very exciting time for us, and we are very interested in hearing what Chairman Bingaman is going to have to say about some of these issues later today. So let me also say this is a very kind of fortuitous day for this discussion, because the G8, as you probably saw in the papers today, has finally committed, or I should say the U.S. has joined the G8 in committing to meaningful CO2 emissions by 2050. And I think this underscores the international dimension of this issue. What we do here in the U.S., the leadership position that we take, is going to be critical to the leadership that the world shows. And of course, the Copenhagen meeting at the end of next year creates kind of a timeline here. If the U.S. can get our act together next year and perhaps pass climate change legislation, we will go into the Copenhagen process with a real sort of position that we can then roll out, hopefully get the world to embrace. So that's kind of creates a timeline on this issue. Let me now say a little bit about Senator Bingaman, who has shown such leadership on this issue. He is, of course, the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He has been a leader on climate change for a number of years. He proposed legislation with Senator Specter on this issue. He has held hearings on it. And so going forward, we would expect him to continue his leadership on this issue. As chairman of the committee, Senator Bingaman has also been engaged in other really landmark energy legislation, including the 2005 Energy Security Act and the 2007 Act last year, which updated the CAFE standards and committed the U.S. to biofuels, and really kind of moved us forward on a path towards energy independence and energy security, which is fairly groundbreaking in recent history. So without further ado, I want to give you our speaker today, Chairman Bingaman.
Michael, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for being here at this early hour. I appreciate it. I was told to talk about climate change and prospects going forward, what thoughts occur after the effort we made here this last month to proceed on climate change legislation. I think you're all aware that on the 6th of June we tried to invoke cloture to proceed to real consideration of the Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act, and we were not able to do that at that time. We did not have the votes. I think we're also generally aware that that was the one real opportunity we had in a legislative sense to move ahead on this issue before the end of this Congress, since the end of this Congress is scheduled for 8 or 9 weeks of legislative activity from now. From one perspective, the short debate that we had in the Senate on the measure was a disappointment. There were no substantive amendments that were offered since we were trying to invoke cloture to proceed to the bill, or really to go ahead. Despite the tremendous effort that was put into it by Senators Lieberman and Warner and Boxer, and all of them deserve great commendations for their efforts. But despite those efforts, much of the debate was very general. Much of the debate did not, and I think pretty much all of the debate did not get into specific merits of particular parts of the proposal. If you look at it another way, though, the debate was very encouraging, at least from my perspective. I think it demonstrated very clearly that Congress is now past the period of talking about whether or not climate change is a reality. We're on to the agenda of how do we put together a proposal, a mandatory regulatory regime to mitigate global climate change in a significant way. And that's a major undertaking, but the fact that we have gotten to that point and have a consensus on that, I think, is encouraging. Nobody really expected that we could pass legislation in this Congress. The President, of course, indicated in several statements that he would veto any mandatory limits on greenhouse gases that would be put forward in the form of a cap and trade system. And I think clearly a lot of people in Congress, myself included, needed the additional time to try to master the complexities of the issue, not just the complexities of climate change itself, but the complexities involved in trying to craft a plan to deal with the problem in a meaningful way. One thing I do believe is clear to most of us, at least, and that is that any proposal to seriously address the challenges of responding to climate change will require sustained action over many years, and that would include a sustained commitment to keep taking increasingly more stringent actions over the decades ahead. To approach the problem responsibly, it's important to understand two things about the scale of the global climate change issue. First, we need to understand the scale of the problem. Second, we need to understand the scale of the system, the energy system that we have for producing and using energy, which is the major cause, the major source for greenhouse gas emissions. We need to understand the scale of that and what's involved in trying to change that. Michael referred to the fact that his center his group is focused on transitioning the economy from a high carbon economy to a post-carbon economy. That's a major undertaking, and I think we're all just awakening to that fact. We have to keep an eye on both of these issues. On the one hand, if we fail to recognize how enormous and urgent the problem of climate change is, then we may fail to act responsibly and sensibly and soon. Clearly, we need to do all of those. On the other hand, if we fail to recognize the enormity of the task that we're taking on, I think we may embark on a course of action without making it clear at the start that there are going to be sacrifices and changes of a major nature involved. There are four possible strategies for dealing with climate change that have been floated in one form or another in the recent months and years. The first strategy, which I would attribute pretty much to the current administration, is to rely primarily on funding of research and development for new energy technologies and rely on voluntary measures by the private sector to solve the problem. By itself, in my view, technology development is not going to do the job. New technology is always going to be more expensive initially than the conventional way of doing things. So unless we start putting a price or cost, recognizing the cost associated with greenhouse gas emissions from conventional industrial and electricity plants, we will not be able to change the incentives that result in the current dominant position of high carbon energy technologies. So I don't think the first strategy is adequate. Second strategy that's been advocated by several is the idea of a carbon tax. This is the path that the province of British Columbia just recently chose. While this would clearly associate a price with greenhouse gas emissions, we do not know ahead of time what price would result in the most effective reductions of such emissions. Too low a price and you're just increasing energy costs without changing the balance of energy technologies that are being implemented. And too high a price and you are changing consumers, you're charging consumers more than they need to pay in order to see the desired change in greenhouse gas emissions. So I also wonder, frankly, when we hear all the discussion about a carbon tax, I wonder whether some of my colleagues in the Senate who criticized the cap and trade proposal and have argued instead for a carbon tax, whether those are individuals who've also signed the pledge against imposing any new taxes. I remember one conversation with a member of Congress early in my time here in Washington where he said he was not opposed to seeing new taxes imposed, he was just opposed to voting for them. A third strategy that has been contemplated for dealing with the climate crisis, and one that really has been implemented to some extent, is to directly try to regulate greenhouse gas emitters through command and control regulations. But if you think of the size and complexity of the energy system that we're trying to change, direct regulation on a plant-by-plant basis seems fairly impractical. If we also, or it will also likely be more expensive to consumers. It's economically inefficient. The economists tell us that it's inefficient to squeeze reductions from some sources when those same reductions could be achieved somewhere else far cheaper. And of course, that brings you to the idea of cap and trade. And that's the fourth strategy. I believe that it is the most reasonable strategy for us to try to move ahead with at this time. The advantages of a cap and trade system is that the advantage is that it places a cap on total emissions, but it incorporates flexibility mechanisms that allow regulated entities to seek out the cheapest possible reductions that can be achieved throughout the economy. I believe most members of Congress are persuaded that this is the preferred strategy to pursue. Both of our presidential candidates in the upcoming election have agreed that this is the way to proceed. Not all of the cap and trade designs, of course, that have been proposed, at least in my view, would be workable in helping us to achieve what we all would like to see achieved through a cap and trade system. So at this point, I'd like to sort of lay out some thoughts. I've divided them into 10 separate thoughts or principles that I think should be considered as we try to move forward with legislation for consideration in the next Congress, and that is the task before us over the next few months, is to try to get consensus on what the new administration and the new Congress would be able to move ahead with. The first of these 10 is that, in my view, the legislation should be focused pretty exclusively on the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This has to be the paramount goal. There's a temptation to use climate change legislation to accomplish a number of different priorities, many of which are noble and worthwhile. There's a lot of revenue generated through a cap and trade system, through the sale of allowances, and a temptation to use that revenue for multiple good purposes. But given the difficulty and complexity associated with just transforming the energy sector, if we try to make legislation of this type serve a variety of other worthy purposes as well, we'll wind up with a system that is too complex to get off the ground. That leads me to the second point. In my view, we need to avoid making climate change legislation any more complicated than is necessary. We should try to pass legislation with a minimum of carve-outs, either for particular states or regions or for particular industries. If we're to have long-term support and buy-in from the public, the program will need to be sufficiently transparent and straightforward that it can be generally understood by those who pay attention to this issue. A third general thought or principle is that we need to be realistic about how well we can plan for the distant future. Global climate change is a long-term problem that will need decades of sustained commitment. And having said that, in my view, it's unrealistic to imagine that we can legislate today for the next 30 or 40 years and expect to get it right. The bill that was recently before the Senate contemplated various standing 42-year permanent appropriations. I think the reality is that we do not really know what our climate-related priorities will be that far into the future. New information on the climate challenge will become available. New technologies for responding to the challenge will either be proven to work or will be proven not to work. We need to force a fresh look at the whole problem at least once each decade, and that probably means crafting legislation at this juncture that will have to be reauthorized in order to force Congress to do that fresh look. Fourth thought is that we need to make use of our existing departments and agencies to administer the programs, and Congress needs to be involved in the appropriating of the funds through its regular committee structure. There's always an attraction to creating new institutions, new boards, new trust funds in order to bypass existing structures. An institution that exists only in concept can look far better than the flawed institutions that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But there's a significant time and opportunity cost associated with starting a new institution from scratch. And since addressing climate change is an urgent matter, we probably do not have the luxury of inventing significant new portions of the federal government before we undertake this serious effort. Fifth, we need to set ambitious but achievable targets for emission reductions. Targets are important to give certainty and guidelines to those who need to plan. They're important to set out what is necessary to avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. But it will not do us any good to legislate targets that are unattainable or technologically unfeasible. Public support for the program will erode over time if the only thing that we accomplish is a failure to achieve overly aggressive targets. For a reality check on what is achievable, I think a good place to start is the Energy Technology Perspectives 2008 report that was issued last month by the International Energy Agency. That report sets out the actions that are required to achieve two different scenarios. The first scenario that they lay out there is the actions required to ensure that global greenhouse gases emitted in 2050 are no greater than those emitted today. And when you review that report, you'll be persuaded that that's a fairly robust agenda of action items that will have to be accomplished across our entire economy. And the second scenario details the actions required essentially to do what the G8 announced yesterday, and that is to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the year 2050 from today's level. as the report makes clear, the second of these scenarios can only be achieved with an enormous change in the way that our economies function throughout the world and the way we produce and use energy throughout the world. The sixth thought is that we need to provide assurances that the costs of a cap and trade system will not go out of control, either through excessive prices for emission allowances or excessive volatility in those prices. We need to be clear to the American people that a new regulatory program will increase our energy prices and that those increases are necessary as investments to reduce climate change. Costs that go out of control, however, will merely shake public confidence in the legislation, will endanger the stability of the policy. I was concerned that the efforts to control cost in the legislation that we were considering on the floor were inadequate. Its cost containment mechanisms, its main cost containment mechanism was a provision to have another auction of allowances with a floor price that was more than double the floor price in a regular auction. In my view, any effective cost control would have to provide for a ceiling price on allowances rather than a floor price. Seventh principle or thought is that we need an upfront commitment to technology even before cap and trade legislation could take effect. Especially what's needed is to figure out if carbon capture and storage will work on the scales or at the scale that will be needed. We need to invest in this technology agenda immediately, even before the implementation of a cap and trade system, so that we can figure out right away if our caps are based on technically viable options and whether coal can continue to play the major role that it historically has played in energy generation. If carbon capture and storage is found not to be viable, that will severely alter the energy policy pathways that we will need to be pursuing. The eighth thought is that we need to figure out how any new climate change law will interact with the Clean Air Act. Recent Supreme Court decisions have mandated that the EPA regulate at least some carbon dioxide emissions under the Clean Air Act. Either we make clear at the outset that a new climate change law supersedes whatever might be in the Clean Air Act, or we work through in detail what responsibilities are covered under each statute so that we do not have extensive confusion and wasted time and a multiplicity of court cases. The ninth thought about this issue is that we need to ensure that we start the program up in a workable manner, including the initial deadlines and timetables that we put into law. Agencies and departments will have to produce several sets of new rules. Those rules will require adequate study and public input. The federal government will also have to administer activities such as auctions at a scale that we have not carried out in the past. We need to make sure that we set deadlines for the rulemaking and for these new activities and responsibilities that are achievable in the real world of federal agency operations. 10th, and finally, this mercifully is the last of these, there needs to be a single national cap and trade program for greenhouse gases, in my view. The energy infrastructure in the United States crosses state boundaries, and energy markets are regional and national in scope. We cannot, in my view, effectively regulate something as central to our energy system as carbon dioxide emissions on a state-by-state basis. We should not overlay cap and trade programs over other cap and trade programs. States have a legitimate role in promoting energy efficiency and clean energy technology. separate from, and in addition to a cap and trade system, but we should not have multiple overlapping cap and trade systems in place. I say this with the recognition that my own state of New Mexico would like to start regulating greenhouse gases directly, and perhaps do so by joining with other Western states in a regional cap and trade partnership. And in the absence of a federal program, there's no way to fault that initiative at the state level. Clearly the states have moved ahead here more quickly than we in Washington have, and that's to their credit. But when, and I believe it's not if, but when, we are able to enact a federal cap and trade system, in my view, it should preempt the field. That's one more reason why it's imperative that the federal government act sooner to deal with this issue rather than later. So in conclusion, let me just refer again to the fact that the G8 in Japan did end their meeting yesterday with this statement that all of the G8 countries, including the United States, are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 50% of current levels by the year 2050. I guess I had two thoughts when I saw that news. One thought is that it is perhaps a cynical thought, is that it's easier to make that commitment to what ought to happen by 2050 in the last 6 months of an 8-year administration than in the first 6 months. The other thought is, I remember someone saying at one time, we are about to learn what Moses learned over 2,000 years ago, and that is the easy part is writing it down. And the challenge of crafting a proposal and legislation that will actually work to meet the kind of goal that the G8 has adopted is enormous. Congress needs to plan to work with the new president in meeting that challenge, and I, of course, pledge my best efforts to help in that regard. So I'll stop with that. If any of you have any questions, I'm glad to respond. Yes?
Yes, several years ago, Congress passed legislation to encourage federal agencies to commit to teleworking economy, and it's been successful. 7% of federal employees now telecom. Wondering what your thoughts are on comparable measures to encourage businesses and private sector agencies to encourage telecommuting in order to reduce gas consumption.
Well, I think it's a good suggestion. You folks here in the back, I think maybe you couldn't. Let me sort of repeat it. He was pointing out that a few years ago we did pass legislation to try to require the federal government to do a better job with facilitating telecommuting by employees as a way to reduce energy use. And he was saying, why don't we consider doing the same thing for the private sector and provide some incentives for private companies to do that. I think it's an interesting idea, and I think we need, frankly, we need to do a little homework about how successful we've been with the federal effort and look into it, but I think it's a good suggestion. Yes?
In the wake of the labor and water bill that was done entirely within the Environment and Public Works Committee, do you feel that your committee should have a larger, more explicit role in the next Congress when climate legislation is taken up?
Well, I think there's a real desire on the part of people on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, both Democrats and Republicans, to be heavily involved in the issue, and we expect to be. Exactly what role we will have in any actual preparation of legislation, I don't know, but I think we've had a great many hearings and workshops looking at different aspects of the issue up till now, and we will continue that through the rest of this Congress, and I'm sure in the next Congress. Yes?
Sir, what's your timeline on passing climate change legislation next year, the year after? What's the realistic view?
Well, realistically, I think it's very much up to the next president as to what order Congress proceeds to deal with some of these issues in. If the president makes this the first item of business, then Congress, I think, will try to follow through and respond. If this is put off until later in the first or second year of an administration, then I think Congress will probably accede to that. Yes?
I've been in the environmental regulatory business for quite a while, and I know that in the air pollution field, we've done cap and trade kinds of things, and the bubble policy is the same sort of thing. The economists tell us that all of this is far less efficient than some kind of a tax mechanism. And I'm not sure that I see any real inconsistency between putting on a cap and trade program as your primary regulatory tool, but then introduce a gradually, very low level carbon tax that, as you say, we need to know the right level, we'll find the right level over time, and establish the expectation that there will ultimately be a cost to using carbon in all uses, whether some of which will likely cover by the cap and trade. Seems to be adding that kind of a mechanism without a lot of light at the beginning, but with an understanding that it's going to be gradually phased in would be very useful.
No, I think that's an interesting suggestion. It's very possible that some combination of these strategies that I mentioned would make more sense than just picking one and not pursuing any of the others. I just don't know what, again, I think it'll be up to the next administration whether it wants to get behind something other than or in addition to a cap and trade proposal. Yes? Well, I think there are a variety of things we've been trying to do to promote more use of renewable energy and more production of renewable energy. And of course, the most immediate thing is our efforts to pass the bill which has come over from the House to extend the tax credits. Most of these are tax credits to the production tax credit for wind, the investment tax credit for solar, various other tax provisions that are intended to encourage more renewable energy production and use and more efficiency. I hope we can get that done during this short work period here the next several weeks. I think the majority leader intends to try once again to get that legislation accomplished. We also, of course, have proposed and tried to pass a renewable electricity standard, requirement on utilities to go ahead and produce a certain percent of their power from renewable sources. We've failed so far. I think that's still a top priority to get something like that in place. I think it would make very good sense for us to have that nationally. So those are the two areas where I think we're trying to more directly encourage use of renewables. Yes? I'm probably not the right one to answer that question. That's clearly not something that's the Energy Committee is likely to have primary jurisdiction on. I think that, frankly, any new treaty involvement is going to have to be determined by the next administration, and then Congress, I think, will come along and play its appropriate role in trying to ratify or debate and consider whatever the administration chooses to do in these areas. But I don't think it's realistic to think that the Senate is going to set the agenda for what we ought to be doing internationally. I think the next president's going to do that, and I think the area where we can make the most contribution, we in the Congress and we in the Senate, is to come up with a proposal for controlling greenhouse gas emissions here, as we've been trying to do, that gives us credibility when we go into international negotiations. Yes? Yeah.
You mentioned, you spoke quite eloquently about the need to avoid the temptation to spend some of the revenues that a bill is raised through allowance auctions or allowance sales for noble purposes that have little or nothing to do with addressing climate change. Could you give us an idea of what you would spend that money on? I imagine helping low-income households adjust to higher energy prices might be something that meets that test. What else?
Well, I think clearly we're going to have a very major investment in research and development of new energy technologies over the next couple of decades. We're going to have to ramp that up substantially, and this report I referred to, this International Energy Agency report on technologies, energy technologies, makes that case very persuasively. So from my perspective, it would make sense to use revenues generated through a cap and trade system to make that investment, because I think that investment is directly related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, although not immediately. Now, you're right in suggesting that we got the report from McKinsey I guess earlier this year, which said that in their view, increased efforts at weatherization were the most effective, cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I could see a substantial increase in the federal government effort to help with that. That's another example. Yes?
We have this letter from 10 of your colleagues. How steep a climb is that going to be in overcoming some of those objectives as climate change legislation?
But which letter is that? We got a lot of letters around here.
10 largely Midwestern Democratic senators expressing some
Oh, right.
about the
Right. I don't think there was anything in that letter that was inconsistent with what I said this morning. I think they were indicating their concern that legislation be workable in a variety of ways. And as I say, I had no problem with what they said in their letter. I think those are valid concerns. We need to try to address them in any legislation that we try to enact. Yes?
Senator, your discussion about the need to make sure that there's not this patchwork of various different state level programs would supersede any protecting those programs. Is that part of the deal that you would do with the Senator Specter and subsequently new legislation on new Congress that would some of those supersede those state programs?
I don't think our legislation that I introduced with Senator Specter specifically addressed that. But it's my view that to have a good, workable, rational, enforceable system, we should try to be sure that we don't have a variety of cap and trade systems in place at the same location, so that businesses could know if they're in compliance with the cap and trade system that's enacted on a national level. They would at least have met that requirement. That doesn't mean they will have met all the other requirements that a state or a locality might impose on them related to energy efficiency. But at least they wouldn't have to be obtaining allowances and turning in allowances in various cap and trade systems. That's my own view of a rational way to proceed. Now that's, I'm sure, objectionable to a lot of folks. And as I say, the states have, particularly the states involved with RGGI. California's moved ahead aggressively. Some others have begun to move ahead, and they're to be commended for taking it on, because there's certainly been a lack of leadership here in Washington.
And if I may quickly follow, do you plan to introduce climate legislation in the new Congress, in the next Congress, and if so, would it contain such a superseding agreement?
I haven't made any judgment as to whether we would try to introduce a new improved version of our other bill or not.
Oh, excuse me, why don't we take 3 more questions, because I know the senator has other commitments.
Yes?
And regarding the issue of safety valve, would you consider resetting the price, which is set at $12, to keep up with the carbon prices that we're seeing on the European emissions trading system, just to readjust it to reflect what current carbon prices are?
Well, I think clearly we would want to revisit a question as to what is the appropriate level for a safety valve. The bill that Senator Specter and I introduced that had a $12 safety valve in it, that was about a year ago we introduced that bill. There's been a lot of change since then, and I don't think there's likely to be a lot of change between now and the time we get into a new Congress. So I think that's very much a movable issue. Yes?
Senator, if you're against the new bureaucracy program,
I'm having trouble hearing.
if you're against creating new bureaucracies on this carbon program, is that something you would oppose, the idea of a Federal Reserve type board as laid out in more legislation to tinker with carbon markets?
Well, I don't know that would say I'm necessarily opposed. I just think that as a general matter, the point I was trying to make is, as a general matter, we've got a lot of agencies in the federal government right now. We ought to try to find ways to use those agencies to accomplish the objectives that we have in this legislation, instead of trying to set up new agencies or boards with very expansive powers. I think that just I think there are a lot of problems involved. We've encountered that, frankly, in our efforts to establish a loan guarantee program in the Department of Energy, which is nothing near as complicated or major as setting up some of the new entities that have been contemplated as part of climate change legislation. Say again? Well, I think the setting up of that so-called Federal Reserve type board was put forward as a cost containment provision. I would prefer myself to have something that would more directly control costs, such as a safety valve. That's what we had in our bill. I think that there's just a lot of uncertainty about who might be appointed to a new board, how the board would function, what they would determine in the future. It's all very uncharted territory.
One last question.
I think we waited them out.
Yes.
Thank you all very much.